Well, thank you and welcome. The government tells us that every 5 minutes we need to be building a new house in the United Kingdom. Okay, just think about that for a second. A new house every 5 minutes. That's an awful, awful lot of houses. Okay, I'm fortunate enough to live in Devon, where we perhaps don't suffer to the same extent as you do here in the southeast, but nevertheless, every day, all around me, I see the effects of urban expansion. So, hence the topic for today. This is the gateway to Torquay, made famous by faulty towers, or perhaps you might know it better as the southwestern Riviera. And what you can see in this image is the new major link road that's been built down here, but also the degree of urbanisation in what's essentially a rural county. Okay, not only do we have the demands of all those new houses, but also, of course, every new person comes with them and with a need for ever more resources. We need landfill sites, okay? We need mineral extraction. We have precious metal extraction sites for mobile phones just down the road. And of course, we all need a supply of energy, which has led to me working on renewable energy as one of my major research topics. So we've got a really fast pace of urban expansion. And of course, we don't suffer nearly as much as some parts of the world in that at least our population is moderately stable, unlike the global norm. But we're also facing rapid changes in technology. If we look at just one factor, this is lighting, something I work on rather a lot. The amount of lighting in the natural environment is increasing exponentially. So in 1923, there were a mere 23,000 kilometres of lit road in the UK. Okay, and the power of that light was very low, 0.8 lux. That's sort of around the level of a full moon. By 1998, you're up to 160,000 kilometres, with orders of magnitude greater intensity. And now, anybody can go out, they can go down to B&Q and buy lamps of a type that would have been unimaginable just 10 years ago. We can work in millions of candle power. Okay? And I think we as a research community are struggling to keep pace with some of these changes, and we're struggling to understand what the impacts are on our natural environment. We're still struggling to understand the impacts of changes in agricultural policy. If you think it's only really since the war that we had the major revolution in agricultural practice in the UK, and yet still we're seeing the impacts all around us. Not only that, but interestingly, I think people are becoming less aware of what the impacts might be. I was fairly horrified a couple of weeks ago to ask my students what was the major change in British farming since the war, and I was met with completely blank looks. I then asked them about meadows, perhaps, lost. Why? Nobody. Does anybody know what silage is? So, even some of them who lived in the country, quite extraordinary. Okay, and some of the issues we have, I think there's a bit of a problem in that as ecologists, we often use a shorthand and we say, oh, you know, there's an intensification of agriculture. And I think quite reasonably the NFU often gets quite cross about this and says, well, hang on, you know, the major changes happened 30 years ago and not that much is changing since. But I think there are things that are still changing. Here, there's basically no structure left because it's now just too expensive to do hedge laying, even in beautiful Devon. It's really quite a rarity. And if you look at the grassland, we're getting what is now becoming known as smoothed grassland. So smoothed grassland basically means there's nowhere for anything to live. Okay, so we have no structure. You're losing, because of the intensity of grazing, which is going right up to field margins across here, you're losing the herb-rich bottoms of meadows and so on. And I think a huge elephant in the room with the pollinator debate, I'm not really here to talk about pollinators, but is if you look around the countryside, what is there to eat? It's not very surprising that pollinators are relying on things like oilseed rape because there's bugger all else there, is there? Okay, so if we look, this is the Natural Ecosystem Assessment review of change in land use. And basically what you can see is this is change between 1998 and 2007 in the blue, and the more recent change here. So we're getting a pattern of increase abundance of improved grassland, whereas rough grassland is declining. Interestingly, there's also a decline in arable production. And that's partly driven by climate change, partly driven by a change to grassland, and partly a loss to urban expansion. Now, often I get telephone calls from people terribly upset that the local farmland is about to be built on, and from very understandable reasons. But I do think it's worth restating the fact that actually a lot of the green and pleasant land we see around us is very green. It really is, if you put that much nitrogen on it. It's very green, but it's not actually all that pleasant for most things that might want to live in it. And to borrow a term from Jane Memmott at Bristol, who studied biodiversity on farmland extensively, they found that most biodiversity on farmland is actually found here in what she calls the dead tractor zone. Okay, it's the place where dead and dying tractors and other bits of rubbish go on farmland. The reason that's good for biodiversity is actually there's a chance for things to grow there. There's a chance for herbs to develop, for pollinators to come in. There's a bit of structure. You might actually get field voles living there. And in some cases, you know, urbanisation can actually bring an increase in diversity, believe it or not, compared with the arable desert that might have been there beforehand. And certainly in the case of hedgehogs, it's fairly possible that actually they're providing something of a refuge for this species at a time when they're rapidly declining elsewhere. So we've covered two major challenges. We've covered urbanisation, agricultural production, and also I think there's a third really major challenge that we have to get a grip on, and that is the role of invasive species. And unfortunately, quite a lot of the particularly problematic invasive species are mammals. And I think we haven't been good at acting quickly enough when species have first been introduced. So now you have a situation, for example, where the grey squirrel is regarded by many as an integral part of our countryside. We run at the Mammal Society an annual photography competition. You're all very welcome to enter. And one of the most commonly photographed species is a grey squirrel, because that's what most people see in their gardens or in their parks. And it's a matter of huge concern, therefore, that we're getting reports of raccoons, for example, that have been popping up around the country. Last May, I was in Poland, and the most commonly recorded species that we found on camera traps were raccoons, okay? And the implications of that could actually be enormous. We really have to get a grip on that. There are also some, I would call them invasive species, that are political hot potatoes, that a lot of organisations, charities, would rather not talk about. And I'm not saying that pheasants and cats are necessarily bad. All I'm saying to you is we don't know whether they're bad or not, because nobody is actually doing the work to investigate that. To put this into context, there's about 7.5 million cats in Britain. Every time there's a new urban development, urban expansion, that brings with it something like 1.5 new cats per house. Okay? If you compare that with our most recent estimate of the number of foxes in Britain, we've probably got around 500,000 foxes, probably got about 400,000 stoats. Okay, so the number, you know, just on a simple numbers game, we're dealing with potentially a big problem, but one that often people aren't prepared to even talk about for fear of upsetting people. Similarly, there's a lot of vested interest in pheasants and shooting them, but who knows what the implications are for the rest of the ecosystem. Might be good, might be bad, but I just think it needs looking at. So as Malcolm mentioned at the start, what we've landed up with in the UK is one of the countries with the lowest biodiversity intactness indices of the entire world. Okay, so this is a measure developed to look at what proportion of original fauna is retained within a country. And basically it goes from the dark colours very, very bad, and blue would be good. Okay, so you can see some dots of blue in there if you look very hard, but basically most of our traditional species assemblages have gone. And I think this is, you know, if anything should wake DEFRA up to realise that actually we do need sensible and integrated 25-year plans for food and environment together, not as separate things, but together, surely that one map should do that. And it also raises interesting problems for us, because we have to decide what is it that we're actually aiming for when we're doing conservation. Now, I'm not about to rehearse undergraduate lectures where we discuss the potential things that you might be aiming for. Are you aiming for greater species diversity, or are you aiming to retain just keystone species, or what are you doing? But I think people often have a rather, fuzzy feeling when they think about conservation. They like to think of situations like that. We've got Squirrel Nut King, rafting his way across the Lake District to these beautiful wild hills. And much as I love David Attenborough, I do wish he'd stop talking about the wilderness, because I don't think there is very much wilderness. There's certainly no wilderness that I'm aware of in the UK. And I think it's kind of unhelpful that actually what we've got is a really highly modified landscape, and we need to decide where we're going with it. I think we also have to recognise, again, when we get warm and fuzzy and decide that we all want to preserve red squirrels, in that we've been messing around with mammal populations on this island for a very long time. We actually managed to exterminate them pretty much from Scotland, so much so that they had to be reintroduced. And once they were reintroduced, it coincided with a lot of new forestry plantations in Scotland, and they became what was considered to be a pest. And so the Highland Squirrel Club actually had a system where you could send in your tails and get a bounty for every squirrel that you managed to kill off. And they were pretty successful. They killed more than 100,000 of them, okay? So humans have had, our fingerprints are all over the way that our current fauna looks. So when we look at this sort of map, which compares the pre-1985 distribution of the red squirrel, which are the black dots, and then the post-1985 distribution, I can tell you it's got a lot worse since then. A lot of those red bits have disappeared. We tend to want to think that this is all due to an alien invader. There's a sense slightly of being a bit like Donald Trump, who just blame it on the Mexicans or something. But actually, we've done an awful lot of damage ourselves along the way. This is a place that I used to go to when I was a little girl growing up near Preston in Lancashire. And one of the things I was rather touched at when I looked at this on Google was it was called Bluebell Wood to me, and this is Bluebell Way now, and you can see there aren't many bluebells. And not only this area used to be absolutely full of red squirrels. It was the place that you would always go and see red squirrels there, and obviously there's none there anymore. So regardless of what we did about greys, these areas are no longer suitable because we've managed to fragment the habitat to such a degree, remove the trees that they need for food and so on, that basically there's little, if any, chance of recolonisation. Okay, so what are we going to do about all this? We need to get a grip on where it is that we're going. Are we trying to go back to some kind of agricultural revolution vision? Or are we going to do something more than that? One of the things that the government and the Mammal Society has contributed also to the State of Nature report, which is a report produced every few years by a collective of NGOs, trying basically to raise awareness of the growing crisis in British wildlife conservation. And what we can show is that there is a trend, a general trend of decline, whether you're looking at abundance or occupancy, across a very wide range of species. There are, though, problems with some of those measures. One is that priority species are dominated, or these indices are dominated by a very small number of organisms. Okay, they're really, really dominated by birds. Why? Because people like birds, they're easy to see. Similarly, why is the main insect index? Butterflies, well, because butterflies are easy to see. And, all credit to them. Butterfly Conservation and BTO have done a fantastic job over many, many years of actually collecting robust data sets. So I'm not knocking that at all, but what I'm saying is we need similarly robust data sets from a whole range of other species in order to come up with indices of trend that are more sensible. And much as I love bats, I think the domination of the mammal index by bats is also highly, highly problematic, not least because bats are very long-lived species. If you were going out and picking a bioindicator, I'm not sure I'd land with bats, because they can take so long to respond to change. And as we've seen, the pace of change at the moment is very, very rapid. And what are we missing? Well, we're missing, again, you know, going back to kind of the undergraduate lecture, we're missing things like the harvest mouse, which might tell us interesting things about the structure of our landscape, about potentially the loss of things like the hedgerow bottoms, the margins of fields that have gradually been eroded by common agricultural policy. We're missing any information at all on most small mammals. We've just been in the exercise of doing the first review, this is the last review in 1995 by Steve Harris of the population status of all British mammals, and we're doing a new one. Fairly unlikely to be another one for 25 years, I wouldn't think, given the current economic climate, and yet we can't say anything sensible about what is supposedly our most abundant mammal, which is the field vole. Can't say anything really about any small mammals at all, even though they're obviously the cogs that make the whole of the rest of the food web work. And we can't even say, okay, well, we'll just measure the carnivores instead. So, you know, if you're doing censuses in Africa or something, you don't necessarily have to measure all the small stuff, because you can go and count how many lions there are or other carnivores that are eating them. Well, unfortunately for us, our carnivores, the remaining ones, are mostly very small and elusive, so we don't have any sensible data on those either. And let's not even start on what might be a potentially important ecosystem engineer or an indicator of soil health, but moles. We know nothing at all about moles. How amazing is that? And as for rats, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to direct you back to the Daily Star, which seems to know more about rats and their size than any other publication I've come across. Frankly, we know nothing at all about the status of this species, which is one of our most common species, we think, but, you know, one with potentially enormous ecological impacts on native species. We know nothing at all about the population status of rats. Okay, but do we know anything about how habitat is changing? Perhaps it doesn't matter that we don't know the exact numbers of small mammals. Perhaps we can just say how habitat is changing instead. And it turns out that even that is quite hard to do. So there's a few places you can go to try and get relevant information. You can look at the land cover map, which uses satellite data basically to categorize land into different types, like arable production or I don't know, urban land. Or you can use the thing called the countryside survey. The countryside survey has people going out, collecting data in the field. Okay, it's a much smaller survey, but it is meant to be representative, and it is collected by good people at CEH who know a daisy from a dandelion. Okay, now the problem is that these two things, this is looking at change over time. Sorry, I need to stop doing that. It's looking at change over time, and the bottom doesn't matter necessarily. All I want you to see is that the bars aren't necessarily lining up with each other. Okay, so we've got different, apparently national indices telling us different things. So if you're interested in something like the amount of unimproved pasture, you're struggling really. And you can compare it at the bottom. This is the National Ecosystem Assessment, which largely is based on farm business surveys. So that's what farmers say they're doing. And basically this survey takes over their accounts for the time they're in the survey, so you'd hope it were right. And you see some correspondence, but the detail is a problem, okay? Even if these all married up properly, I still think we've got a big problem in that we're not collecting data at the resolution that we really need it. So if you're wanting to know something about dormice, for example, you're probably going to need to know about the structure of the woodlands available to them. If you want to know about field voles, you want to know, is there tussocky grassland available? And you can't get that easily from these data sources. Okay, so that's a problem, something that needs to be fixed. Okay, is it all doom and gloom though? Well, you know, I've said that we don't have data on lots of species, but there are some species that we're getting pretty good information on. These are the ones that are more equal than others, as Orwell might have said. And largely that's driven by them being a European protected species. And more often than not, you're designated as European protected species if there's European-wide concern over your conservation status. So you're never going to get a field vole listed as a European protected species because there's too many. Might be very important in an ecosystem, but you will get something like dormice listed. Okay? And that's partly the reason why, for example, in Devon, we have far more dormice, apparently, if you look at the records, than we do wood mice, even though that's patent nonsense, because people like recording stuff that's rare. We've got a bit of a rarity obsession. Now, European protected species legislation has been very useful in some ways, and it's meant that, for example, for bats, habitats, their roosts are now actually protected in law. And that means, hopefully, those breeding sites are going to be maintained for the future. However, it's not without its problems. And, you know, these sorts of headlines of bat houses costing £20,000 and so on occur regularly. And there are some in the bat world who would argue that actually European protected species licensing has been a disservice to the interests of bat conservation, because now everybody hates their bats rather than embracing them as something interesting that they'd quite like to have in their house. So I've just started a bit of work with CIEM, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, to try to assess, first of all, if this mitigation, which can be very costly, if it's instituted, does it actually work? Because if it doesn't, we shouldn't be telling people to do it. And secondly, to then come up with good practice guidance that hopefully will mean that in the future things will be done better. Now, European protected species licensing is really good for protecting individuals, so you can't go and knock a dormouse on the head and kill it. You can't go and destroy a bat roost. But it's really rubbish at protecting the connectivity of populations or species in the wider landscape. Even when allegedly there is meant to be some protection, so for a few species that are on Annex 2 of the Habitats Directive, you're meant to, or there is an obligation on governments to actually protect their habitats such that they can move between alternative places that they need. So if I'm a bat, I need my summer roost, my maternity colony, I need a hibernation site, I probably need to go somewhere different to mate, and so on. And those whole areas are meant to be protected. But in reality, it actually works terribly badly. Now, this is a picture, I'll avoid touching the computer, this is Torquay down here going north up to Chudley, for those of you who know it. And the point of this picture was this was brought to me by somebody from the local authority who just said, just look at the way all these developments go next to each other. So some are mineral extractions, a lot of them are housing allocations. The grey is what's already built. Aren't we making a north-south barrier up and down this part of the world, which we happen to know is very, very important for bats? And what can we do about that? And at the moment, it seems that it's actually very hard to do very much. And I'll tell you more about that later, about some ideas we've been having about how to make it better. Again, though, it reaches the headlines with this sort of thing, you know, dormouse bridges and so on. But frankly, the permeability of the landscape is terribly important. And compared with the millions spent on infrastructure projects, you know, if you can make a dormouse bridge that works and doesn't require it to somehow leap from one bit to another, you know, maybe that's a good thing. But again, they need to be evaluated to check that actually they do what we'd like them to be doing. And I think this is one of the places where it all falls down, is can we actually show that if we don't do something that there's going to be an impact? This was some work I was doing with some friends there. We were trying to catch bats in order to radio track them, to understand the potential impact of electrifying the West Coast main line. Okay, and there were many things that were perplexing us about this job. One was, first of all, how to catch anything that might constitute a representative portion of the population. And then even if we did, and we radio tracked, it wasn't our idea to do this project, by the way, this was thought up by a consultancy. Even if we did radio track them somewhere, then what? How are we going to follow them and demonstrate that future electrification had done anything at all? And really it was that project that got me thinking about, you know, the crazy way that lots of these sorts of projects are set up, but that they don't seem to think through actually the then what sort of question. And it happens all the time, all right? We've got HS2 and all the protesters, we've got, you know, new runways at airports, we've got wind farms, and often they get a huge amount of, you know, public backing. People don't want these things in their backyard. They suddenly become the friends of all the protected species on the site. Couldn't care about the field voles, but they do want the protected species. But even if you go and spend an awful lot of money monitoring, how are you really going to demonstrate that the future plan project is going to have a negative impact? Well, one thing we could do is think about actual fatalities. Okay, this is the A38 in Devon, and I know that 3 greater horseshoe bats were found dead on the road just up from here. And I've done a review with one of my students of data from across Europe and find that actually bats are hit rather a lot on the road. And we can also say, okay, most of the casualties, if you do a systematic review, you put all the studies together, what we can see is that most of the ones that are hit are actually low-flying species, which are not the most common species in the total community. So there's a differential effect on low flies, which kind of makes sense. If you're flying high, you're not going to get hit by stuff. Similarly, in the case of wind farms, you could actually do something to quantify the numbers of casualties you've got. This just amused me the day that we published our results. We had the Daily Telegraph telling us that I said that wind farms could be killing 80,000 bats a year, while the Financial Times said 200 bats a month. And I don't think you need to do lots of stats to know that those numbers are nowhere like each other. And neither of them are correct, actually. But even if you come up, as we did, so I did a national scale study, looked at 46 wind farms across the UK, really detailed surveys to work out exactly how many bats are being killed at each site. Even then, the huge elephant in the room is kind of, what then? What does that actually mean for a population? Now, at a national level, we're trying to fix this problem. So we're doing the national review, in this case of common pipistrelle numbers, and we can come out with some sort of estimate around about 3 million probably. And we've got some rather wide, plausible estimates, depending on the parameters that you choose to plug into there, somewhere between 1 million and 7 million-ish pipistrelle bats. So in that context, you know, killing 2 bats per turbine per month, or whatever it is, doesn't seem an awful lot. However, it could be an awful lot if your particular wind farm is already in a place where either bats are on the edge of their range, so they've got quite a low population size, or if it's a place where they're already suffering from cumulative pressures from lots of other stuff. So say there's also not just your wind farm, but you've got a massive great housing development down the road, and you've got a load of new lighting. You know, you can see how all these things add together. At the moment, we have no way of addressing this, and I'm finding it very, very difficult to persuade policymakers that actually what they need to do is start looking at impacts on populations. It's not beyond the wit of man to radio track local populations, find where the roosts are, and actually monitor those over time to demonstrate that there's an effect, or maybe there's not. You know, we could also, if we had the data, we could produce some harvesting models. So we could say, okay, what if we did kill 100 bats per site per year? What would that do? But in order to do that and make a sensible model out of it, we do need some basic data on bat population dynamics. Okay, and it's that sort of thing that's really difficult to persuade people that it's a good thing to fund. They'd far more like to send you out just to find a few corpses and then scratch their heads about what to do. So I've talked about direct fatalities. There's also, of course, a direct loss of habitat, which, you know, you're not going to find dead bodies, but there will, one presumes, be an impact on the population dynamics of the species. Not only is there, you know, the bricks and mortar and tarmac, but also associated effects. So you've got lighting, you've got noise. There's meant to have been something like a 25% increase in noise pollution over the past 20 years. You've got emissions from cars and so on. We're not very good at understanding the impacts of those things. This is a bit of work my research team have done looking at the barrier effects of lighting on bats. So what we do is we've looked at roosts across the southwest, so the roost is indicated by a star in the middle of the circle. And then we put out bat detectors in locations as similar as possible in habitat, but which were either dark, which are the black dots, or they were street lit, the yellow dots, or they've got household lighting, which is kind of the orangey dots. And what we can see is that for some of our rare species, they seem to be extremely light shy. So for the lesser horseshoe bats, if you look at the numbers of passes per night, it clearly declines considerably as you go from a dark to a lit environment. The same for greater horseshoe bats. Using data from lots of static detectors that we put out, we could also look at a range of other more common species which are often thought to be light tolerant or possibly even to benefit from light. So there used to be talk of bats would go and exploit perhaps the moss that would accumulate around street lights. What we were actually able to show using an awful lot of data was that with the exception of Leisler's bats, which are rather uncommon in the UK, we teamed up with Bats Ireland to look in Ireland as well, where Leisler's bats are common. Leisler's bats do seem to be attracted to street lights and do seem to forage around them. Everything else, they seem indifferent to the presence of light. That doesn't seem like they're getting a feeding benefit. If you look at their feeding buzzes, certainly no benefit. Okay, so we've got a range of these different pressures. We've got the lighting, we've got the housing, we've got the barrier effects. So potentially a bat will now refuse to cross a road just because it's lit. What are we going to do about that? Or what are the constraints on doing something about that? Well, this is where we get into planning policy. And before you all fall off your seats with boredom with the legalese, basically, in order for a planning condition to be put on a planning application, so say Bovis Homes want to build 50 houses somewhere, and the local authority wants to put on a planning condition that actually perhaps they can't have external street lighting, or they have to construct a big bund to block the light from a bat roost. The condition has to be shown to be necessary. It has to be also this marvellous thing, reasonable in all other respects, which I think is a get-out-of-jail-free card, really, isn't it? Because how do you decide what is reasonable? They also have to be enforceable, which is another interesting one, because you could argue, well, how can you enforce something? If you've made a housing development, and then the developer actually decides that they've done completely the wrong thing in all their back gardens, it's not actually enforceable. I've had that situation occur several times where something was meant to have happened, it was in the licence condition, but then it couldn't be enforceable, couldn't be enforced afterwards. And that planning policy document, which comes direct from Downing Street, seems to be a little bit at odds with the habitats regulations, which I think even post-Brexit, we're going to have something a bit like the habitats regulations, we imagine, because we'll still be signatories to the Bonn Convention. And the habitats regulations kind of tips this on its head, and it says you need to actually protect all these Annex II species. Remember, here we're only talking about things like the very rare horseshoe bats. And they have to say that there has to be no satisfactory alternative to it. Okay? And that the favourable conservation species must be protected across the range. So that seems, fairly powerful stuff. But in reality, it actually seems very difficult to enforce this. There are very few bits of case law that mean that local authorities feel confident in doing this. And indeed, I've been told by some local authorities that the ecologists have been told, my planner wouldn't put in the conditions that I wanted or wouldn't support me in objecting to this planning decision because we don't have the money to keep going to appeal. Okay, if you're going to appeal against NPower or some of the big housing developers and you're a poor local authority, you cannot afford to keep losing. You also can't afford to be hauled in by central government for not meeting your housing allocation targets either. Right, okay, so let's look for positive things. What are we going to do to make it better? Well, David Attenborough was quite visionary at the State of Nature report release. Andrea Leadsom not quite so much. And she talked a lot about pocket parks or parquets. Now, I was brought up to believe that parquet was a type of flooring in Lancashire, but apparently not. This is a parquet. A parquet is a small urban park, yeah, which is all good. It's good, you know. I'm not sure it's going to do much for wildlife conservation, though, to be absolutely honest. And I think sometimes we get a bit muddled in our thinking as well about balancing this ideal that green is good for us. We know green is good for us, and this was a paper, it was a news report just this morning about air pollution. You know, we know that actually green space is good for mental health. There's lots of benefits to getting out and about, okay? That's all brilliant, but that is also brilliant. You know, if you paint walls green in offices, you also get positive benefits, okay? So let's not get too overexcited in this, because I think also a lot of people, you know, my students who don't know what silage is, they wouldn't know a perennial ryegrass field from a species-rich grassland. So, you know, frankly, the idea that necessarily we're going to preserve biodiversity by latching onto this human health benefit thing, I think might be a little bit misplaced. And we also have to realise that when we're thinking about our cities and our urbanisation, we've got kind of good vision, bad vision on this slide. I quite liked it. We need to be thinking not just about what's happening in the urban environment, so the urban clean air, and this very much seems to be where DEFRA is coming from. You know, we want to make our green infrastructure good within cities, and that's fantastic. I don't object to that at all. But a lot of the impacts are actually off-site. You know, it's the wind energy development or the new power station, or it's the linking roads and so on that are actually occurring outside the centre of the urban areas. Okay, so let's think a bit more visionary then. Some people have this sort of vision. Okay, wouldn't it be nice if we woke up and that's what it looked like, or we had these links, or that, looking in your trail cam. I'd be quite excited by that. Now, the issue with that, though, is that those were all taken from the Chernobyl nuclear exclusion zone. And absolutely remarkable things have happened there. And it's been latched onto by people who are in favour of rewilding as, you know, this maybe is the utopian vision that we restore the wilderness and we get back our higher predators and suddenly all of our ecological processes are fine and we can step back and we don't have to do anything about it. Nature will take care of itself and things will be in balance. I think that's a bit of a problem in a country where we're managing to send a rodent to extinction. You know, this is genuinely a cause for some embarrassment at international meetings. You know, how can you make a rodent, a water vole, nearly go extinct? All right, so I think we're some way off the rewilding vision. And I think also we have really serious issues about the amount of space available. So people often cite Yellowstone National Park as a good example. You know, we've got some walls back in Yellowstone National Park. And look at all the cascade effects. You know, the problem is we just don't have very much space in Britain to do this. Yes, there might be a few Scottish estates where you could do things. But, you know, there's a danger that we kind of get carried away in this. We have to remember Norway. Norway is one of the most developed countries in Europe, the highest GDP, and one of the least occupied countries. So it has the lowest population density. They've just instituted a cull of their wolves and are going to have one wolf pack left because 47 was too many, okay? And we're really thinking about that for the UK? I'm not sure. And, you know, I think there is a danger that we end up with a bit of wildlife gardening. This is Knepp Castle, and Knepp is a brilliant example, beautiful place, you know, absolutely fantastic. Love to go there. But I'm just not quite sure how applicable it is to the rest of the country and whether we end up with a bit of, you know, the Marie Antoinette, so we'll get some peasants in and we'll have a few wild beasts running around, and wouldn't that be nice? Now, what can we do then? I've been a bit miserable and laughing at everyone so far. I think there are a few things, and what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is to highlight some of the ways that I think we can make progress. So one would be actually trying to get hard engineering projects to consider some softer, more ecologically friendly solutions, because at the moment there's clearly a two-tier system. Anybody who knows ecologists who work for maybe a water company or the highways agency or whatever, ecology is the bottom thing on the list, when actually it needs to be much further up. This is an example of what beavers can do. This is one of the reintroduction sites in Devon, where you can see that what was a very small pond has expanded. It's turned into a whole wetland habitat, supporting a really wide variety of species. It has positive benefits. We can look at above beaver and below beaver water quality. Okay, and the slowing of the passage rate of water through the catchment is really doing great stuff for water quality there. Saving money at the treatment works. This is a view from my back garden. You can see the rather dismal, this is Devon, but rather dismal perennial ryegrass there. And also the complete lack of structure in that bit of river. And the reason is that it was straightened because people wanted to get the water down the catchment as quickly as possible and out to the sea. And as a consequence, we've got virtually no bankside vegetation, not helped by the fact that the cattle are in the river the whole time. But, put a few beavers in the system upstream, and what hopefully you would end up with is a wetland network, looking something like that, which has been done in Germany. Now, these things are actually possible if there's a political will. And the great benefit of this is also, it's just a different way of managing water flow. And beavers will work 24/7. If the dam bursts, they'll go out and fix it, okay? Which probably people working for the Environment Agency won't, or they need a lot of money for it. The second thing is, I think we need to use what we've got more effectively. So we need to recognise, I've mentioned a lot about data gaps, and I think those data gaps are really important. And there are ways we can fill them. The map on the left shows academic institutions who work on bats. The map on the right shows distribution of consultants, and there's even more volunteers who are interested in going out and collecting data. So if we can harness that effort to collect data in a standardised way that we could then use to inform decision making, how much better we would all be. We also need to make sure that what we do is actually sensible and actually works. I love this from the Daily Mail. Thank you, Daily Mail. We did an assessment of looking at how effective pre-construction environmental impact assessments were in picking out which wind farm sites actually were going to have a negative effect on bats. So what I did is compared 29 of the EIAs with what actually happened post-construction. I should say that out of the other 46, we weren't actually able to get hold of those reports at all. They just disappeared, or maybe they're in a basement in mid-Wales if you want to go and have a look. But basically, they're completely inaccessible. I think that's another problem. Huge amounts of money are being spent on this, literally millions of pounds. Anybody who's an academic in the room will know how hard it is to get a few million quid of funding. And yet this is being spent all the time, like it doesn't matter. So 18 of the 29 concluded there was no risk at all, and of those, 9 had casualties, and the casualty rates were up to 64 bats a month, okay? Which is quite different from no risk, I'd say. And if we just ranked the sites according to the numbers of casualties up the side, against the perceived risk along the bottom, what we can see is that there's quite a mix. So at the bottom here, we've got some sites where there was no risk, allegedly, at the pre-construction assessment, they ended up having high casualty rates. On the other hand, we also had some where the pre-construction risk was perceived to be high, and they still went on and had high casualty rates. Now, what that's telling us is the mitigation didn't work, because this thing should not have got planning permission unless it had mitigation in it that was meant to offset that perceived risk. There was meant to be no net loss to biodiversity from any of these sites. Okay? So what you can see is whatever they were doing wasn't working. And I think this is part of the problem, that we're playing catch up. So we get a technology or we do a development without really following through what's actually happening and doing that follow-up monitoring, and then being adaptive and thinking, okay, we've shown that this works or that doesn't work, let's do something about it. Just an aside, why this doesn't work, this is some new work we've just done, and we've got some evidence now of the bats actually being attracted into the wind turbines. So this is looking at paired sites, so we've got controls and turbines, both in similar habitats, measured on the same nights, and these bars going upwards here show that there's more activity around the turbine than there is at the control site, with only a few sites showing the reverse. Which leads to an interesting conundrum, doesn't it? Because then what do you do about that? If actually having the turbine there in itself is sucking bats in, it's going to make it very difficult to predict in advance where to go, what to do about it. There are ways out of it. So one would be, actually you just stick with a mitigation measure that you know works. And talk a bit more about that later. But interestingly, the legislative position at the moment makes that very hard because developments aren't meant to go ahead unless you can demonstrate through your ECIA that there is no net effect. So what do? You've got a situation of imperfect information beforehand. It may not be possible to say what the impact is. And yet, you have to allege that there is no net effect in order for it to go ahead. And there's not really a good system of saying, okay, we'll monitor after whatever development it is, and then if there's a problem, take steps to fix it. Because the current view is, well, once something's up and running, you can't then go back and tell people that they have to change the operation. Okay, so that's a big problem. One thing we can do, though, is where we have evidence that stuff works, is we can try and make sure that that information actually gets out to practitioners. Because one of the things I've noticed, so this is our new Watervole handbook for mitigation for developers that the Mammal Society's made. We're doing similar ones for dormice and badgers and a series. Because one of the things that we realised was that often there's a slip between the best laid plans at the top and what actually happens on the ground. So what you need to do is engage people at all levels so they're actually very clear about what needs to be done. Okay. We've also set up at the Mammal Society a website called EcoBat, which helps people interpret their bat data. So again, we've got a situation where literally millions of pounds is spent collecting bat data. People will put in an ECIA and say, oh yes, I had out 12 static detectors and they recorded 4 barbastelle passes a night. And there was actually a case of a planning application being turned down, not on the basis of not having followed the correct protocol in collecting the data, but the chair of the planning inquiry said, I have no idea what this means. You've told me there are 4 barbastelles, so what? How am I meant to judge what impact the development will have just because you've told me activity levels? Okay, so I think it's getting back to that, so what? You've recorded something, so what? What do you think the impact is going to be? And I think we're too shy. We keep standing back and saying, well, we just report what's there. We need to go that next step. Another thing we can do is hopefully prioritise the simple stuff. There's lots of stuff that isn't rocket science. Making houses bat permeable is not difficult to do. It doesn't actually cost a lot of money. It's just a question of leaving little gaps around that they can get into. And also making sure that when things have been suggested, they're actually done. So this is a review I did of some development cases in Devon, where basically there was just a complete mismatch between what was meant to have happened and what actually happened. So, for example, there should be low-level lighting below 3 lux at ground level. We went out and measured it with a lux meter and found it was 6.5. Site design is going to avoid placement of south-facing windows because it was known there was a bat flight path to the south of the site. They went back, all the houses had south-facing windows. External security lights on south side of buildings not permitted. All the houses had security lights because this development was dark, it had no street lights. So what did everybody do? Everybody went and bought a massive PIR light because they didn't like coming out in the dark. Okay. What else can we do? Well, this is a bit of a rant, but I think we need to stop the single farm payment system, which, for those of you who aren't that familiar with agricultural payments, this is the payment that a landowner gets, which is based simply on how much land you keep in productive state. And what that means is that if you want to set aside an area of your farm for wildlife, which might just be, you know, little strips around the farm edge, or perhaps fence off a river so your cattle aren't getting into the water, at the moment, as a farmer, you're penalised for that. And it's a real problem that wildlife trusts are battling with, because, you know, you get good people, they want to do the right thing, they're really happy to help, but they know it's going to really knock one of their main sources of income. Okay, so the SPS, the single farm payment, is purple on this slide. You can see it's a really big proportion of total income for most farmers who are already on really tight margins. And I think this is one of the key contrasts perhaps with places like NEP. The thing about NEP is there you've got, you know, a multimillionaire who can afford to take that risk and say, hey, it'd be really great, we can have all these animals and people come on safari and we can do photography. You know, tell that to the average tenant farmer, you know, who is already making a loss or barely making a living wage. They just don't have the wiggle room to do that. We need to do something else. So, what can we do? Well, one is try and think about alternative ways of paying for stuff. And at the moment, normally we pay farmers based on how much they produce, which means they get all the profit. Okay? The alternative system, sometimes called PES, Payment for Ecosystem Services, is based on the idea that you do stuff that's good for the environment generally, and it provides, for example, flood risk management. It improves water quality, it might improve biodiversity, and you get payment for that instead. And the nub of this question, though, is who does the paying? Because the payment on the production bit will now be reduced because you're delivering all these other services. Now, a case where this has worked really well is South West Water. Decided to start, well, they had to ask Ofwat for permission to do it, but they're able to put a levy on water bills to pay farmers to actually improve the way they're managing their land. And the reason that they wanted to do it is if you look at this, water came from two main sources, the Tavy, which is a very clean river, and the Tamar, which is terrible. So in the summer, when water demand is highest, suddenly there's a huge spike in treatment costs because they had all this nasty water coming out of the River Tamar. So what they're able to do is put 60p on everybody's water bill, and they work with the West Country Rivers Trust, and what they tried to do is basically take all the farmers from the bad farm on the right, no, bad farm on the left, to good farm system on the other side. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that instead of letting your cattle into the water where they're eating everything, they're making particulate pollution in the water, you get slurry running out of the farmyard straight into the stream. Instead of that, you're fencing off the margins, you're paying for hard infrastructure, places to actually store the slurry properly and so on. So that's been a huge success, and there's now similar stuff going on in the Lake District, I think it's Wastwater, where there's a big landowner, which is the National Trust, who's engaged. And the water company is really benefiting by those reduced treatment costs. One of the problems with this, though, is most of the examples of payment for ecosystem services are all around water. Because the good thing about water is you've got one huge consumer, the water company, who has lots of money and infrastructure and can play with this stuff. And the benefits are very obvious in terms of water treatment and so on. Now, there's a lot of places, though, where this really isn't going to apply. This is the coast of Devon, just down the road from where I live. And you can see in this area, there are no major waterways into which these fields are draining. It's very highly managed. There's nothing in the bottoms of the, you know, everything's grazed right out to the bottoms, or the arable production is going right up to the field margins. There is not a centimetre for wildlife here. So water doesn't always work. People have argued about, well, what about cashing in on recreational benefits? Again, a bit like the health benefits. You know, it's good for people to like to go out in the countryside. And the government's very keen on promoting access to the countryside. In fact, if you look at the Forestry Commission website, and Natural England's website, and NRW's website, and Scottish Natural Heritage's website, one of the first things they're talking about is public access to the countryside. One of the reasons that it might be good is it means that people are more engaged with things, and there's an argument that people won't conserve stuff if they never go there. I can see that. One of the downsides, though, is that it means that the highest value is put on places very close to urban centres. High value is put on things like conifer plantations that have cycle paths through them, because that's what people like to do. So actually, just to convert all our, you know, if we said, let's make all of our woodlands accessible for people to go mountain biking, I'm not sure that's going to really deliver the benefits that we want. So I'm just going to finish with a couple of ideas I've had where I'm working with local authorities to try and see if we can actually do something a bit more creative. Now, one of the problems, I think, at the moment is, say you have a bat roost, so you're in the circle in the middle. You unlucky person, because you bought a house, you probably didn't know there were bats there, and suddenly you're lumbered with not being able to do anything. It's going to cost you an arm and a leg if you want to get, you know, your roof redone or something. And yet, presuming that we think that there are shared benefits to these animals being there, surely that cost should be shared throughout the community, because they're everybody's bats. They're not just your bats. And the dots here show when we put out bat detectors, this is where they are. They're clearly going, you know, 4 kilometres from the roost. They're everybody's. They're not just that individuals. Now, there is a model for taking a more radical approach that's been used once in the Netherlands, where actually what happened was proactively, money from development was used to conduct a major project to find out where all the bat roosts in the community were. Money was put into a central pot to improve those habitats and provide offsets elsewhere. So you were proactively thinking, what can we do? How can we link up bits that aren't well linked at the moment? And there was not a cost going back to the individual roost owner. Okay, so suddenly everybody wanted to have a roost. And I think similar things have happened in the States where they've tried to use payments for results. So, in other words, if you're a farmer and you manage to get a rare pair of raptors breeding on your land, brilliant for you, and we'll give you some money as a consequence of doing that. All it requires is somebody to be the banker in this, somebody to hold that money, and actually, rather than the current situation where either we hammer people because they have rare species, or we try and tie them into an agri-environment scheme, which doesn't actually pay all that well. And the response of most people, quite naturally, is I'll get my money by doing as little as possible, which is, I think, why most agri-environment schemes have been pretty much a failure for most species. It's because people don't actually change what they're doing. They'll tick the easiest box in order to get the money. Whereas if it's a results-based business, it changes the mindset. The next thing, is the treasure of the commons rather than the tragedy of the commons, is I think we need to stop being obsessed about the red line of development. Anybody who's ever dealt with a development will know that the planners will put a little red line, or the developer put a red line around this particular development. That's what I'm interested in. Okay, so if I'm worried about effects on biodiversity, I'm looking within the red line. And whilst officially they're meant to look outside that area, frankly, it never happens. There was a recent case of a wildlife trust who went to appeal because there was a big development that basically encircled an area that had been set aside as compensation for a previous scheme. So they were going to end up with this compensatory habitat completely encircled. And the Court of Appeal judge said, but you surely accept that the principle that in development there's no negative impact on biodiversity on the previous site, because that's what the ECIA said. And there's no net negative impact of biodiversity of this development, because that's what the ECIA said. And yet you're trying to tell me that because you've now got 3 developments together, there will be a net negative impact on biodiversity. You've added 3 lots of zeros and come up with a number bigger than 0. And he said that was absolutely preposterous. You couldn't have had 3 zeros and come up with a number bigger than 0. But of course, it's obviously true that, taken ad absurdum, if you cover the entire country in concrete, sooner or later, there's going to be a cumulative impact. So I think we need to stop being so obsessed with looking just within the red line. One of the things I've been discussing, and I think we've really made progress on this, is also saying, lots of places are important not just because of the animals that live in them, but just because they might be important passaging places, they're important commuting routes. In the case of bats, our local Natural England person was saying, well, I'd only worry if I was suddenly picking up, or if a report came in and said, yes, there's lots and lots of bat passage through this site. Then I might worry about it. Otherwise, you know, if it's low quality habitat, I won't worry. And what we're able to show by putting out hundreds and hundreds of bat detectors and use, well, first principle from mathematical modelling is as animals radiate out through a landscape, your probability of encountering them will decline the further away you get from the central point. So this would work for bats or possibly badgers, you know, anything that's social. Bees would be a similar thing. So basically, the further you go away, the lower the probability of the encounter. But we do know that they go long distances because we know from radio tracking that nightly they will go about 4 kilometres. So if you just assume that they randomly walk, you know nothing else about the habitat, what we can say is the further we go, the harder it is to find them, just because there's more space. And therefore, the probability of you ever getting a bat report saying you've got loads and loads of bat passes is terribly, terribly low. If you look at our real data, which is this one here, basically as soon as you get about 200 metres from the roost, the numbers of passes you get in a night fades to almost nothing. Okay? And it's just purely a physical thing. So instead of this approach of we'll go out, we'll monitor, and then wonder why it is that our predictions are also rubbish about the effect on populations, how about we do some modelling instead? We model the sorts of things, the sorts of areas that we know bats like to go, we know where the lights are, we know where the good habitat is. We can actually produce these sorts of models for local authorities, that's Buckfastleigh. And we can look at interactively at what would happen if we were to split off one of these commuting routes. Where would they go instead? So maybe we should start being proactive rather than reactive all the time. And in the same vein as being proactive, we also know that a lot of the pressures aren't evenly spread across the landscape. So this is the South Hams sack that just happens to have lots of important bat roosts in it. Okay, there's one down here, some over here, some over here, and the traditional approach was, well, we'll try and draw some lines that are connecting these roosts together and hope that the bats sort of go down them. But it can lead to all sorts of problems because you keep getting challenged by every developer of why do I have to do this here, whereas Bob down the road, who's only 250 metres from me, isn't doing any bat surveys. That doesn't seem reasonable. So what we decided was actually most of the development pressure is over here. And so as a blanket rule, what we're going to do is worry about that site, that area a lot more, and make absolutely sure that we know what's going on in that area and try and think strategically about actually can we pool all the money from those multiple developments, which I showed you earlier, how they're making that big string. If we put all that money in a pot, we can actually use that to improve the permeability of that area. Okay, so we're talking to the Highways Agency now about doing things like, can we put up structures that will actually divert bats away from the road? Can we plant up hedgerows in other areas to make that more attractive? So rather than keep chasing the money at surveys, which aren't actually doing anything, let's try stuff instead, try it experimentally, see if it works, use that data. If it works, then we'll wheel it out on a bigger scheme. And really, again, it comes down to the crux of who's being the banker, who's prepared to do that middle bit to put the money where it's actually going to make a difference. And going back, I'm going to finish with the wind turbines. I think we can say the same sort of thing. Presumably, we all want renewable energy. We all don't want climate change. So why aren't we, instead of hammering wind companies for killing, a few hundred bats per site, two things we could do. One is we could institute a system that we know works, which is we curtail them at low wind speed because that's when most casualties occur. It won't cost the wind companies that much because most of their energy is actually generated when the turbines spin fast in high wind, but it will cost them something. Okay, so how about we just put a premium on the tariff for electricity at sites where there's curtailment, and so we know it's wildlife friendly. Okay? It doesn't seem to me unreasonable to do that, and it would save everybody years and years of headache, years of doing surveys which actually are very poor at predicting where the problems are. And I'm going to finish there, but I'd be very, very happy to take some questions.